Hello and welcome to the Sacral Circle, where we are healing sexual trauma collectively and lovingly. I'm your host, Janie Terrazas, and I'll be interviewing women from all walks of life who have had to face a sexual tragedy or abuse in one form or another and triumphed over their adversity. On every episode, a guest will deliver inspirational support, words of comfort, and empowering healing advice. They'll courageously share how their experiences impacted their lives and what led them to face and conquer the blockages that kept them from fully reconnecting to their inner power and divine feminine sacredness. Be sure to visit my website, JanieTerrazas.com, for more information on my healing and coaching services, and subscribe to the Sacred Stories podcast on iTunes. I want to thank all of our listeners for joining us today on the Sacral Circle, the self-love haven where we leave judgment at the door. And today I'm very pleased and excited to have the time and energy of this lovely soul. Her name is Susan Pease Banitt, and she is a therapist and a social worker in the Harvard Medical System. She has over 35 years experience in mental health work. She's the author of a fabulous book called The Trauma Toolkit, Healing PTSD from the Inside Out. And I really love your tagline too on your website, which says healing mind, body, spirit, and community, one symptom at a time. Hi, Susan. Thank you so much for being with us. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. And I just really love this trauma toolkit. I can't wait to kind of get into the toolkit here with you in just a little bit. But first, one, just thank you so much for, being with us and sharing your wisdom and sharing your story. And just so that we can kind of let them know how they can find you, and then we can kind of start getting into this.
Yes, you can go to www.supv.com, like peanut butter, supv.com.
Okay, excellent. I highly recommend you go check out her site. She's got fabulous blogs, lots of great information. Of course, you'll be able to get information about her book there too. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into this line of work? Because I find that, always the guests that I have on the show have dealt with trauma to some degree in their own life, which really, makes their line of work just like that much more special to them. So tell us a little bit about your story and how you ended up getting into this field of healing.
Yes, when I got into the field, this field really young, so as a teenager. And I started working with autistic children, actually, in high school, and then discovered Freud in high school and decided that there was nothing that interested me as much as the mind did. I wasn't really aware that I had a lot of trauma at that point, because I think a lot of young people just kind of take their upbringing for granted and don't really realize if there's trauma involved or not until later, quite often. So I got into it from a place of passion and wanting to help people, wanting to be in service, and just being fascinated by behavior and the mind. And I really loved connecting with people who had trauma, although we didn't label it trauma at that time, but a lot of autistic children also have a lot of trauma. So I enjoyed that connection.
And you'd mentioned you yourself had dealt with some experiences. And about what age did that occur for you? Was that something that happened when you were younger? Is that what you were saying? Is that sometimes something trauma happens to us as a children and we don't really recall it until a little bit later? Is that what happened with you?
Yes. I mean, there were layers. So
okay.
I grew up in a brilliant, hilarious, and very dysfunctional family, kind of like the Royal Tenenbaums.
Oh my God, that's hilarious! That's a great analogy.
Yeah. And so I was aware of the gifts of my family, and I wasn't aware of how dysfunctional things were until I got out of the family. And then I had deeper abuse issues I didn't really become aware of till my 40s, which is fairly typical. What I find is that people are really not ready to hold and process their deepest traumas until, if they stem from childhood, they're often not ready to do that work until their late 30s to mid 40s.
And it's really interesting.
And some people, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say it's really interesting that you say that, because I'm 42, And I also dealt with various types of trauma, but between 4 and 11 was like the initial trauma that kind of got imprinted. And now that I'm 42, I would say it was around 39 when I started to really, it's not that I had like it wasn't that I didn't remember it. I knew, but I thought I had already processed and dealt with all of it. And it wasn't until these last few years that I really went into my truth-seeking journey and my spiritual journey really started awakening. And the real deepest, darkest, like parts of myself started to rise to the surface. And I started to realize that I started to see the intricacies of the trauma within it, like playing out humiliation, playing out shame. It was very, very interesting. So, so you hit the nail on the head, at least for me. I fall into that category where I then was in a place, in a position to truly sit with it and really dive into it so that I can once and for all really be free of all that was sort of living inside of my body. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, right, because, there is no separation between the brain and the body. In fact, the brain is part of the body, and every part of the body connects to the brain through the nervous system. So everything that happens to us happens to our body and creates changes inside of our body. Trauma creates changes in our neuroendocrine system through the hypothalamic pituitary axis. It creates neurological changes in the circulation, right? There's no system that's unaffected by traumatic experience in the body. And that can also get encoded genetically and then get passed down to subsequent generations. And likewise, we come in with some epigenetics of our ancestors' traumas as well.
I've been researching that. I found this really fascinating article with like the latest studies and information that's coming out about this. And, I just love science. Like I wish I loved it when I was a kid, but I didn't. It wasn't until I was an adult and I started learning because I also do, healing work through Reiki. And I started to become just absolutely fascinated with the body and the orchestra of it all and the interconnection between thoughts and feelings and the mind and the body and all of it sort of like feeling. It's like one heartbeat, boom, 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 and they're all touching each other. They're all touching each other. And then when I learned that, I was like, wow, we really, really need to understand our vessels. We have to understand that. I read Deepak Chopra said something like the issues are in the tissues. And I love that because it's such a great way to like describe it because cellularly trauma and memories get imprinted into the cells. So it's literally like in the body, like you just said. It's crazy.
And that's why it's so important to do the trauma work, to sort of pull apart. So when we're having a reaction to something or our body is reacting to something, that we don't go into a lot of stories about it, but we're able to be present with what is actually unfolding and then heal those threads that pop up in our lives as they pop up.
Absolutely. Talk a little bit more about, the definition of PTSD. Like if you had to put it in a nutshell, like how would you describe it? Because, most people have heard it for a while now. That word's been floating around the culture but why don't you kind of give them an idea in the simplistic form, and then also the varying degrees of it?
Yes. So when I talk about PTSD, what I talk about is these three main concepts or things that happen to people. One is that, of course, there's some deeply shocking, traumatizing event or series of events that happen in a person's life. If it happens during childhood and over a long period of time, we call that complex PTSD, because it's a series of PTSDs that sort of interweave with each other and then keep manifesting throughout the body and the lifespan. And simple PTSD would be something like, you grow up without trauma, but then you have like a car accident when you're 30 years old or something like that. But they're both characterized by these different things that happen in the mind-body. One of them is intrusiveness. So there's a sense in which the trauma keeps manifesting in the psyche in order to get healed. And that intrusion can come through nightmares, and it can come through flashbacks or triggers in the body, right?
Yeah.
And another another thing that manifests, so we've got intrusiveness, and you have numbing. So there's a dissociation or numbness that happens around it where to manage those feelings, the body just shuts them down, actually. And if people can't shut them down, sometimes they turn to substances for numbing. So people can't numb or deaden the experience through dissociation. They will sometimes turn to substances.
Gotcha. That's okay. I think substances to cope.
Yes. So often, dissociation, the ability to dissociate happens usually before 7 or 8 years old. People are going to get really good at it, and so when traumas happen before about 7, the brain is very facile and very plastic and good at separating memories into compartments, which we call dissociation. If one is older than that, like you have an adult trauma, car accident, and you never learn to dissociate, you won't be able to use that as a defense. So that's when sometimes people might get substances involved for the numbing aspect of the trauma. And then the third thing that happens is avoidance. And this avoidance is largely unconscious. So, if you were forced to eat a food that you hated and you were physically forced to eat it as a child, you might have an intense aversion to that food or anything that reminds you of that food. But you might not actually remember the original event that caused you to have that aversion.
That's so true. And, this is a point where we can kind of talk about the senses, because the senses are like our antenna, and it's taking in this information. So like you said, they may be unconscious of it, but maybe in that moment in real time, they're smelling something or whatever. And if that smell was anything like the smell when the trauma happened, it'll get triggered, and they're completely oblivious to what's going on. That's why it's so intricate. Right. When we were talking earlier about ancestral things getting passed on, and bringing it back to that is, yes, they now know that certain fears or certain traumas get passed on to us. So then all of a sudden, we're like, why are we so afraid of water? We're so afraid of water. And then you find out that a family member, had drowned or something like that. And right. Especially things like where sexual trauma might happen in a family, and then it continues to keep happening. Have you ever worked with somebody who's dealing with it, but they're also now doing it to somebody else?
Most of the people I work with aren't abusers.
Okay.
Most of the people, or if they are sort of re-perpetrating on anybody, they're perpetrating on themselves.
Okay.
So they're punishing themselves or engaging in risky behavior where they might get re-traumatized. And that just has to do with the setting that I work in a private practice setting. So some of that just has to do with the setting that I work in. If I worked in a prison system or, a community center where perpetrators are being treated, I might see more of those kinds of people. But in my practice, I mostly see people who, if they were perpetrating it all, but we all tend to do that. I mean, if there's trauma, it wants to go somewhere. Until we're conscious of it and digesting it, and often it gets taken out on the victim.
Yes, absolutely.
Takes it out on themselves quite often, or unconsciously on their children in some way. If they don't have the ability to what we call mentalize or conceive of what happened to them. For example, the proverbial person who was spanked grows up, thinks, "Hey, I didn't turn out so bad," and turns around and spanks their children, even though the research is in, it's completely definitive. There's nothing good about spanking. It damages the brain and body. But, people will keep doing it because it was done to them. So that's kind of the classic identification with the aggressor and, re-perpetrating.
Yes. In your practice, your clients vary in age. You've worked with individuals that are 3 all the way up to 80. And would you say that how you treat them is still somewhat similar?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I mean, yes and no. I'm actually writing a book right now for Routledge Press for therapists about the use of attachment in trauma therapy. And so when I think of what is similar is that I want to make the same kind of loving, caring, safe boundary connection with a 3-year-old that I would make with an 80-year-old. But I would meet them where they are at. And it doesn't matter their cognitive ability. It could be somebody with profound developmental delays, because I've worked with that population too, or it could be somebody with an IQ of 160. It doesn't matter. What matters is the quality of the connection and the safety that that person feels in the room with me. That is probably the biggest healing agent. And then the rest is kind of, of course, it helps to mentalize and people educate themselves. So, of course, you're going to talk to a 5-year-old differently than you're going to talk to a 20-year-old.
Right.
But the concept, the underlying dynamics and concepts are the same.
Yes. It absolutely makes sense. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. I feel like when I sit with people and we work through this, the most important thing at the beginning is creating a very safe space, like even the show. It's like trying to create a safe haven. And what that feels and looks like is you're sitting with another individual that has just the deepest compassion for you. And there's like no judgment, and that it's almost like you want to sit with somebody who is going to be a blanket for you. And I think that it's really important when people start to seek out individuals that are going to help them, that they do feel at ease. Would you agree? Or is that not established until a little bit later? I feel like at the beginning when people are finding, a therapist or a healer of some kind, that they should sort of listen to their intuition also.
Yes, goodness of fit is really important in this work. It's probably more important than any other kind of work you'll do, because when you're abused as a child, you learn that adults aren't trustworthy, and then it ruptures your ability to attach to them. Whether or not you're abused in the home, it can still affect your attachments in the home. If you're abused, if something happens to you in nature, it ruptures your sense of safety in the world. It ruptures people's attachment to their idea of God or religion. If you're in the military, it ruptures your idea of the worthiness of what you're doing. I can go on and on. It always ruptures attachment when trauma happens, always, 100% of the time. So for me as a therapist, the very first thing that's important to me is creating that safe space and starting to create a safe attachment. And for some people, that takes longer than others. I had, an extremely abused person that it took her 7 years to start to find some safety in the attachment. But she would still come. She would come.
Yeah.
She would have nightmares about me abusing her all the time. Until she finally connected to a positive maternal image. But it took her 7 years to do that. That's pretty extreme. I think most people can get there a lot quicker than that. But I'm very, over the years, I've been doing this a long time, I'm very deeply respectful of the power of that connection, and the power that if a therapist ruptures the connection, either by being judgmental or disbelieving or just incompetent, that's very, very, very damaging for people.
Yes. And a word that comes to mind is a gentleness. And there should be a level of gentleness there. And I think it's really beautiful that this woman, was diligent, and that and you knew not to push her, and you knew, and that's when when you're with like a really good healer, a really good therapist, somebody that I feel like those that are truly in it, like from the heart, like that they're very passionate about, not just like, oh, this is a line of work, this is interesting to me. But there's like some people that are in it that are very heart-centered. And I also think too, it makes it not a little difference. I was going to play it down, but it makes a big difference when you're sitting with somebody who has experienced a level of trauma like that you have. Because then it brings like a space of permission and a space of like acceptance and a space of, oh, you know me. Like you are me. And then that allows them to maybe even open up more. And in your sessions, do you share anything of your own self? Like if there's ever something that comes up, do you do that with your client?
I share with most of my trauma clients at some point, maybe not the first session, but
sure.
At some point I will share that I have a trauma history.
Okay.
And I give a class based on my book. And what is really helpful for people is to realize that they may not have their stories in common. Their stories might be vastly different. I've had everything from, people with child abuse in their families of origin to people who were blown up, in a bus explosion in Israel but those stories can be very different. But what happens in the body, mind around trauma is the same. Yeah. So I find that we can all bond around what feeling triggered feels like, what being triggered feels like, or how hard it is to be in relationships with people when there's such a lack of trust and attachment, or what shaky attachment feels like, because people who haven't experienced trauma and had good upbringings, they don't really understand insecure attachment. Mm-hmm. It's not really a thing in their world, but it's a very pervasive thing in the world of people who've grown up in abusive families. So people can bond and connect around that. So those are the things I share, that the personal details just, aren't that important and possibly triggering to people too. So those things I keep to myself.
Right. I think one of the things that you're discussing and really expressing and sharing here is this like camaraderie and not necessarily sisterhood. This is a sisterhood because this is mostly for females here, but in general, people uniting together and feeling safe enough to be vulnerable. It's in our vulnerability where we find our authenticity. And so the healing journey is really about suturing, right? Those wounds that we have that have sort of fragmented us, like our soul to some degree, where we're not showing up in the world the way we truly can and are intended to, our joy levels, and sometimes we're not even aware of it, how trauma is sort of keeping us from experiencing more joy and more peace, like from the inside. Could you explain, too, to people that not dealing with the trauma, how it ends up impacting the actual body, how it can show up like as pain and like disease and illness?
Oh, yes. Well, I don't know if you are familiar with the ACEs study, but the Adverse Childhood Event Study that looked at 17,000 people and looked at the number of categories of abuse that people had, or not abuse, but adverse childhood events. So abuse and neglect were there, but also having a parent who's incarcerated, witnessing domestic violence, things like that. Yes. And they found that they have 10 categories, and that children who had experienced 9 or 10 of the categories who grew up to be adults were dying on average 20 years sooner than people who had 0 to 1 categories.
Wow.
Which is a profound public health issue. And so this is actually, and there's a movie called Resilience I really recommend that your viewers take a look at. It was made by Robert Redford's son, Jamie Redford, that really looks at this issue in a very beautiful way and shows very clearly that, yes, trauma adversely affects the body. And I also believe, by the way, that can be reversed through healing. Healing all different dimensions of the mind and body. I think it can be completely reversed in some people, or largely reversed in a lot of people. And my husband's a cardiologist, and we give a talk called PTSD and heart disease, where we talk about how PTSD both causes heart disease and treatments for heart disease can cause PTSD also. We are there because trauma has affected you, but then the medical system itself can be traumatizing for various reasons.
Yes. I want to touch on the trauma toolkit. I don't know if, as we were discussing it, we already kind of were talking about some, or if there are some actual things that you could share with us.
Well, I think that the main reason I wrote this book was to put the healing in the hands of the people, because I didn't feel like there was going to be enough trauma therapists and yoga therapists and people to even go around. And
that's so true. Oh, my gosh.
That seems to be coming true. There's a lot of trauma in the world right now. Yeah, I know. I'm very strong to share this material because I didn't set out to be a writer, but I really wanted to share this. So to me, it's all about unwinding the various dimensions of trauma in the mind and body and working them simultaneously. So you're working on the physical body, you're working on the energy body, you're working on the mind, and whatever levels need to be addressed.
Yeah. It's one of the things that we were not taught growing up is that we are multifaceted beings. There's the mind body, the emotional body, the spirit body, right? The energetic body and the physical body. And we are not taught to nurture, cleanse, like, you know what I mean? Give it any kind of attention. Restore, revitalize, refresh, and it really makes a big difference in the overall quality of your life when you are willing to take accountability and responsibility for how much control you actually have over your wellness. And really, that's where our wealth is our well-being. And you're absolutely right in that there are so many people that are just riddled with sorrow and burden right now. And it's mostly due to trauma. And we've been taught to just take pills and, take this and it'll go away, and you're depressed, and we're just not, we're just scratching the surface, and we're not getting into the root of the actual problem itself. And if you have a lot of really like human beings walking around with trauma, that's going, and it's like depressing them, like it's like dis-ease in the body. Well, the way they're going to show up in the world isn't going to be very bright, and you know what I mean? Not bright as in smart, but just like joyful, and bring that light into the world. And we all have this ability to bring light into the world, and the way we discover it and turn it on is to love ourselves enough. Love ourselves enough to seek out some assistance, and that it's very courageous. We have to make vulnerability now, like Brene Brown, right? She's out there advocating for be a warrior, and a warrior is to be vulnerable. And so I think it's really great that you're spreading this message, and that you and your husband are doing these talks, and that y'all are a powerhouse together, spreading wisdom and knowledge. And I'm right there with you, sister, when you say, I want to teach people this so that they can heal themselves. They could be their own savior of their wellness. And that's very, very important.
Yeah, and even if you're getting treated, like, okay, let's say you're doing an hour of massage a week, and maybe you have an hour of therapy a week, and if you're really lucky, maybe you have an acupuncturist or a Reiki master, but that still is only 3 or 4 hours of a whole week, right? And so how do you get through the rest of the time, with yourself? Because that's the challenge. And anybody who lives with trauma who's listening knows exactly what I'm talking about. Getting through minute to minute and hour to hour can be a major challenge.
And that's what your book is. Your book is filled with these tips and tools and things that they can use in the interim between these sessions that they have with individuals.
Oh yeah, that's the entire book, and it's divided up into which level you want to work at. So if you're working at the level of mind, I give you ideas for working with your mind. If you're working at the level of the energy body, there's exercises for your energy body. If you want to work in the higher mind, wisdom and meditation, there's meditations that I give. So there's you can work all the dimensions, create your own program through the book, actually.
That is so awesome. And I'm going to have to get the book, because especially if it's broken down like that was really genius. I'm guessing this book was divinely inspired.
I hope so. I've been in the yoga world since the late 1980s myself. I really love the teaching of the 5 koshas, or the 5 bodies, and it just struck me as a good way to organize all these interventions, and so that people knew what levels they were addressing when they were going in and doing these techniques.
Yeah, so what I love about Susan is she's got the academic background and the intellect and the all of that information that's very important. But I believe it was in 2000 you started working with the shaman, and you mentioned the yoga that you do, and that spiritual side of the healing, which really, again, this is like a holistic way of treating self. So you really immersed yourself in both worlds, and now that you're able to bridge them. And this is what you're trying to help people with and teach people.
I had to, because I had this explosion of phenomena in my late 30s. I was like, I don't know what to do with dead people coming to sessions. I'm going to get some help with that. They didn't teach that in the Harvard Teaching Hospital.
So I love, speaking of yoga and body and all this, movement, like you said, is really important. What were some of the things that really helped you as you were dealing with yours? At what age did you start working through your trauma?
At some level, I was always working through trauma, but my first therapy was more about attachment work. That was in my 20s and early 30s. And then when I worked with the shaman, we got to the deeper levels of the trauma. And the things that helped me the most were the things I put in the book, like the grounding and clearing exercises, like learning how to really connect to the ground and have that nurture you. And so, if you are out of your body, that anxiety fills up the space between the earth and your body, So you really want to have your feet solidly on the ground, which has always been a challenge for me. And learning how to clear out energy.
Yes.
And those things then can extend to physical. If you'll indulge me for a second, I just had an experience last week where I grabbed a 400-degree pan with my bare hand, and I should have had second-degree burns, but because I'm a Reiki master, and I did Reiki on my fingers while I was running water, but I also knew that I needed to get the traumatic, injured energy out of my body also. So I went outside and put my feet in the ground and ran that all out, and I had no blistering, no pain.
That's just amazing. And it's phenomenal what we are capable of and what our bodies are capable of. And this reestablishing the connection and the communication and the relationship with the body is so integral. And if we have trauma, like you said, it creates a wall. And so we need to like kind of clear out those walls are, so that we can reconnect and sit into our vessels like with comfort and with confidence, and knowing that it's always it's always listening to us, and we can always be listening to it. And like you said, you're using nature, which there's a lot of evidence now. There's all this research that shows, and this is just science again, physics, where electrons are, beaming off of its body and go into our body and fight the free radicals. It's like free antioxidants. It's very difficult for me to go through my day and my world without just feeling like a miracle, seeing the world as it itself is a miracle, really to give honor and respect to your body and to nature. Talk a little bit about the power of visualization and how that can intensify the intention of what it is that you're doing.
Well, the natural connection is hugely important because the body really wants to heal very easily and gracefully in nature. That's my experience. And it's a matter of aligning the body with nature, first of all, and that's through, right diet and right thought and all that stuff. And then, allowing the body to do what it's supposed to do. Because a lot of us, we grow up with a lot of force just by the nature of our educational system and our work system. Mm-hmm. So we're constantly forcing our body and mind to do stuff that's really not in its best interest. Right. And some countries are waking up to this and changing their educational system and their work weeks to align with this more powerfully. Mm-hmm. But we're very far from that in this country at this point. But you can, think about ways to align your body. So how much sleep do you really need naturally? Do you need to rise at, set with the sun and rise with the sun? Or is your sleep cycle different? Can you get at least 20 minutes of sunlight in your day? Because that changes the chemistry of your body. Right? Yes. Are you drinking enough pure water or blessed water? And, yes. Right?
Yes.
Aligning yourself. The sesquiterpenes that are emitted from the trees are healing agents. Like all of nature is basically healing. We need to remember that our body and mind will heal itself if given the right environment, right? So we forget that you don't, like when you cut your arm, you might put a Band-Aid on it, but you don't need to really do anything to make the healing happen. The healing's just going to happen, mm-hmm. right? But you have to rest. You have to protect that area. So what's required is kind of the opposite of what we're conditioned to do, which is like do something we need to stop doing. We need to create enough rest and nurturance around us for the healing process to happen.
That's a beautiful way to put it. The healing won't take place until we are at rest. It can't do what it can do on its own unless we get to a restful state. And
or at least not efficiently. It can do it, but it'll be a lot slower going. Yeah.
Right. Well, this has gone by so quickly. I'm sure there's so much more that you can share. But again, for those that are listening, be sure to visit her website. Go ahead and give your website again and the name of your book and how they can connect you via social media, anything like that you'd like to share. So in case our listeners want to learn more about you and your services.
Sure. The book is The Trauma Toolkit, Healing PTSD from the Inside Out. It's available on audiobook and print, anywhere books are sold. And my website is www.supb.com, supeasebanitt.com. And I'm on Twitter. at Pease Banitt, and I have a Facebook page for the Trauma Toolkit.
Awesome. Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much for being a part of the Sacral Circle Sisterhood and for all that you're doing to help women and other individuals reconnect to their light so that they can have ease and peace and happiness. And thank you to our beautiful listeners for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to the Sacred Stories podcast on iTunes, where you'll find other impactful, inspiring shows. Connect with me via our social media pages. You'll find us at the Sacral Circle. Your shares and likes are greatly appreciated because they help spread the love. If you have any questions about my coaching and healing services, visit my website at JanieTerrazas.com. You can also email me directly at thesacralcircle@gmail.com. As we say goodbye, always remember, know your worth and continue to love and value yourself wholeheartedly. Peace be with you.